Can't say. Good morning. Morning, Mountain View. This is the Sunday morning Bible class. We are studying prophets who were faithful to God's covenant. And welcome to those who are tuned in on the Zoom. And you can also see this class, I believe, on YouTube. Last week we looked at Ezra, and Ezra is the one who led the first group of returnees back to Judah, which, in order to understand how did we get here, it began with Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar sent 3 groups of deportees back to Babylon, taking the best of the best, the intelligentsia, the educated, those who were in royal families, etc. About 20,000, thereabouts. Not everybody left Judea. Not 75% of the population is still there. But the temple has been ransacked and destroyed. The walls of not just the walls that went around Jerusalem are in tatters, holes in the walls, gates broken down, but also all of the key cities were also affected. And so Babylon was running the show. And so you've got 20 to 25,000 deportees that came in 3 waves. And oddly enough, God puts a thought in Cyrus's head that now would be a good time to let those who would like to return to go back. And there is subsequently, oddly enough, 3 groups of returnees. During the time of Zerubbabel, he led a group. Ezra, he led a group. And Nehemiah, this is where we are today. Let's just go back a little ways. From Genesis to Deuteronomy, God is the one who calls out Israel as a special nation and teaches them his will and his laws. From Joshua on to the end of 2 Chronicles, it is God who gives Israel a land and a king, but Israel loses both when they consistently disobey God. And then from Ezra to Esther, it is God who begins the restoration of his people out of exile back in their own land again. So, here we are, Nehemiah, a restoring builder. Now, last week with Ezra, it was quite traumatic, wasn't it? About those who served as priests and Levites in particular. God did not want, and Ezra made it quite clear that foreign wives were not just a disappointment to God, it was something that contaminated the priesthood. And so that was quite a traumatic thing for the people. Now we're in Nehemiah 11 to 20. Just to give you a sense of history, don't you all want a sense of history? It all started with Nebuchadnezzar. That guy had a bad dream. He wasn't really sure what it meant, and Daniel was the key. Then you have the time of Cyrus, 539 to 530 BC. This is the return of Zerubbabel and an individual called Jeshua, Ezra 1 through 3. Oh, do we know, have we run across the name Cambyses? He was son, I believe, Warner, was he not the eldest son of Cyrus? 530 to 522, this is where rebuilding continues. There are a whole lot of changes in who's on the throne in Babylon, but the work continues. The rebuilding at Jerusalem stops during that particular time, Ezra chapter 4. Then you have Darius the first, 522 to 486 BC. This is a time where Haggai and Zechariah are prophets. And they prophesied the temple will be completed in that particular time frame, Ezra chapter 5 through 6. Then you have Xerxes, 522 to 486, 486 to 464 rather. This is where we enter into the story of Esther chapter 1 through 9. Then Artaxerxes Longimanus. Oddly enough, his right hand was longer than his left hand. So I bet that was a problem when he was writing checks. 464 to 423, the return of Ezra, the return of Nehemiah. That is the completion of the three waves. Ezra and Nehemiah were initially one book, just like 1st and 2nd Chronicles were one book. The theme is return, rebuild, and renew. Now, what was God's plan for Nehemiah to return, to reset, and rebuild? If you look at the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah 1 through 6, Nehemiah 7 through 10, Nehemiah 11, and Nehemiah 12, this is what is taking place. The rebuilding of the walls, a rebuilding of the people, which is something that began with Ezra, the rebuilding of the city, and the rebuilding of a return to worship. What I ask you is, do you have a plan to return, reset, and rebuild your life? I think we constantly need that every single day. Now, here is a little cartoon which just illustrates very quickly. Zerubbabel is basically the end of the 70 years of exile. Then a second wave occurs about 60 years later with Ezra, and then the final wave with Nehemiah. I believe didn't Nehemiah go back to Babylon on a visit to see the king?
Yeah, well, he told the king he's only going to be gone a few months.
Yeah. So,
to be years.
Now, if you take Zerubbabel all the way to Nehemiah, how long did the return take? Weeks? Months? How about over 100 years? That's a long time, isn't it? So, the Persians had conquered the Babylonians in 539. The Jewish exiles, they began to return when Cyrus, ruler of the Persians at the time, had permitted the Jews who desired to do so to go back home. Not everybody left Babylon. Life was good. They liked it there. They had grown up there. They had children there. They had homes there. What did they have in Judea and in Jerusalem? Nothing.
Many of them hadn't even been there. They were born in Babylon.
Yeah,
That's all they knew.
in fact, when you go almost to the end, well, actually to the end of Nehemiah, half the people, half the children knew the language of Ashdod and the other dialects, but they did not know the language of God. They didn't know Hebrew. So, 3 waves, as I said, 538 with Zerubbabel, second wave with Ezra, 458, the third and final wave by Nehemiah, 444 BC. We won't spend any time on this because we've been to this slide before, but do you see 2 names there? Shesh Bazar. Now try and say that 10 times. And Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel's name is interesting because it says pressed out of Babylon. Zerubbabel was related to the royal lineage of David. I believe he's related to Jehoiakim and others. And then you have Ezra and, of course, Nehemiah. Here you have in graphic detail the routes that the 3 waves took. If you look at the route that Nehemiah took, that was around 1,000 to 1,100 miles back to Jerusalem. It starts in Susa and goes through up and around and down to Jerusalem. What is interesting about the book of Nehemiah is word gets back from the first wave to Nehemiah, and it's bad news. Nehemiah hears the word that things are in a terrible state. This is about the infrastructure, but more than just the infrastructure. It's about the people, how they're all down and disheartened, how that they just can't believe the state of things. I have often wondered, if God put the thought into Nebuchadnezzar to have that dream, and of course history unfolds from that dream all the way to Christ. God put the idea into the head of Cyrus to be amenable to allowing Jews to return. We call that the remnant who returned. I'm sure the Persians, when they saw who was returning and how many, that it was not a threat to them politically. Israel had no army. Judah had no army per se, because who held the power down there in Judah? Now, Zerubbabel served as a governor, and Nehemiah served as a governor, I believe. Nehemiah, by the way, was cupbearer to the king. What does a cupbearer do? It's more than a butler. It's, I thought, is he sort of like the food taster for the king? If it's poison in the cup, Who gets the cup first? The cupbearer.
He could also be the king's confidant.
Yes.
An advisor.
Someone says like a special aide to the king that is always there to give him advice.
In private.
Yeah. So, prophets in relationship to the exile. Look at the long list of before the exile. Oops, sorry. Look at during the exile. You had Jeremiah writing Lamentations. You had Daniel and Ezekiel. After the exile, you have Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, just to name those. Now, Nehemiah 1 and 11 sets off why Nehemiah wants to lead a group back to Jerusalem. He has a prayer. There are several classic prayers in the Bible. This is one of them. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this, your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man, the king. I was cupbearer to the king. You know, you think about how crucial a role certain single individuals played in the life and times of the people of God. I think of Esther. I think of Nehemiah. I think of Ezra. I think of Moses. I think of many of those men and women who played a crucial role because they stood at the crossroads of something that would make the difference. Have you ever seen a sign, "We buy ugly houses"? You know, I got a flyer in the mail that says, "We'll sell your house for you. We buy ugly houses, any state. Don't clean it. Don't cut the grass. Don't do anything. Just list it with us and we will sell it for you cash." Well, that went right in the bin. God's house was pretty ugly. It was broken down. It was, if you will, a metaphor for the nation. It was a metaphor for the people. Long ago, Nehemiah was interested in renovating that ugly city. The walls, the gates, and more. Jerusalem. His deeper motives for God and his leadership skills, I think, still have much to teach us today. Just takes one person to stand up and be counted. Now, on the table, there are some interesting facts about Nehemiah and some information about who returned and what did they bring with them. You don't have to take one, that's okay. I only printed 20, so there. Ezra's task was to rebuild and restore the nation, the people, the temple of God, and the Levitical priesthood according to the law. Ezra was a bookman. Nehemiah, on the other hand, he had insight about how to get things done physically. Nehemiah's task was to rebuild and restore the holes and the gaps in the walls of Jerusalem. How long did it take? 52 days. Not weeks, 52 days. And that was during a period of great opposition. The state of the temple, its walls and its gates, the gates of Jerusalem itself, as I said, is a metaphor for the state of the nation as a whole, its priesthood and its people. So, the lesson context. Jerusalem had been a distinguished city. It was the apple of God's eye. Spiritual capital of the nation. 1 Chronicles 11, 4 through 9, and 2 Chronicles chapter 3 reminds us of that. But following the division, when the nation as the united kingdom of Israel fell apart, there was a rise of ungodly kings and widespread idolatry. 10 tribes went to the north. Well, they kind of sort of evaporated, if you will. And Judah to the south, 2 tribes stayed. Relatively faithful, but not. And God would bring judgment upon all. So, 586, the Babylonians breached the city walls of Jerusalem. The city-state of massive disrepair still existed in the time of Nehemiah, almost 140 years later. Nehemiah, he was the cupbearer, as I said. More than a cupbearer. He'd be sitting with the king, and the king would what? Say, what do you think about this? So he had the king's ear. And his prayer, as we started there in Nehemiah chapter 1, was to indicate he needed to talk to the king about starting some work down in Jerusalem. He received news of the sad estate. Here I will read it to you. The words of Nehemiah, this is chapter 1, verse 1, son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked, it sort of reminds me, come over and help us about what's going on in Jerusalem in the New Testament times. So I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem, and they said, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The walls of Jerusalem are broken down, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. So he resolved to go to Jerusalem with the king's permission and rebuild the city and encourage the people, just as Ezra and Zerubbabel had been doing. How God's plan to rebuild Jerusalem unfolded, the plan that God had put in Nehemiah's heart for Jerusalem. Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 11 to 12 is, if you're going to have a plan, you need to keep it quiet for a while. Pray about it. Think about it. And he had a group that he had surrounded himself with. And so the plan was kept under wraps, as it were. Not everybody would know. So, number 2, verses 13 to 16, we have the inspection of the damage, but when does Nehemiah go to see the damage? In the daytime? No, he goes by night. Some people like to find out things by night, like, can you think of someone who went to Jesus by night? Nicodemus, yes. And Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 17 to 18, the words that come right out is, look at the trouble we're in. It's not just the infrastructure. We're talking about the people. So, let us go to our text. Verse 11, chapter 2. So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, his trusted companions. And I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. Do you see something that is God continues to put things in people's hearts or heads, like a Nebuchadnezzar, like a Cyrus, like a Nehemiah, like an Ezra, like a Zerubbabel. How about you? What has God in the past put in your heart to do for his kingdom and his church? So, he said, so there was no animal with me, but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate. You realize that that was the gate where they took the dung out. Yes, basically the sewer gate. Terrible. And so I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were there, broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by the fire. And then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool. And there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. I inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, the Sylvia Valley Gate. See that? See, there is a valley in the Bible. And so returned, and the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, and I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. They didn't know where he was. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in? How Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. And then along comes 3 problems. But when Sanballat the Horonite, never invite a Horonite to dinner, and Tobiah the Ammonite, likewise, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, and so they jeered at us. They despised us. What is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Because they don't know what the king has just said, had sent Nehemiah down to rebuild the walls. They wanted the walls and the gates to remain as they were because they feared that it would strengthen Judah, the people of God. And then I replied to them, the God of heaven, he's going to make us prosper. God is going to give us success. And we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. You don't belong here. Horonites, Ammonites, and others. Arabs. That's an odd term. The term Arab, but the term Arab has been around for centuries.
These 3 men were from areas surrounding Judah, or Jerusalem, so they had Jerusalem surrounded with these enemies.
Yeah, Nehemiah was messing things up for them. So, we just read about the opposition versus succeeding. Who are you going to listen to? Those who oppose or those who believe in success? So, surveying the city, there was their arrival and then there was this waiting period, verse 11. Then they had the diagnosing of the damage, how bad things really were. you can well imagine how depressing it was to live in God's holy city that once had a beautiful temple with its walls and all of its wonderful buildings. The nation was downtrodden. And now you wonder, why is Persia allowing this to happen? They didn't like it. In verse 12 it says, I set out during the night with a few companions. What's highlighted in yellow? What my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. I ask you, what is God putting in your heart to do for His church, for His kingdom, for His glory, while you live? Verse 13, he went out by night in secret to see just exactly how bad it was. It's about building a wall, but it's also about building a nation. He says the God of heaven. The term God of heaven appears at least, I think, 10 to 11 times in the book of Nehemiah. He will make us prosper. Not by ourselves, but in partnership with God. He summons the leaders, verses 17 to 18 of chapter 2, and gives them an encouragement to rise up and build. He tells them, God put this in my heart, and I'm putting it in your hearts. And so they said, let us rise up and build. What does objection, rejection, what does people making fun of you do for your faith? Does it make it stronger or does it depress you? Does it feel like you're being defeated at every turn? It happens at work, it happens at school, it happens in a marriage that is perhaps there are two different sides in the marriage, that you're not united with God and in Christ. Arguments, threats. Look at those words just below the first part. Then I said, you see the trouble we are in. Nehemiah says, not you are in, but we are in. We are in a mess. We are in this together. He says, the gates have been all burned with fire. This world of ours is in a mess, isn't it? A real mess. Our country is divided. We need more Nehemiahs and Ezras and Zerubbabels. We need Esthers to come to the forefront and stand where God needs us to stand. And so they said, come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. Rising up from ruin to restoration. You know, it's a firm belief of mine. I believe America needs a revival. I do. Judah needed a revival. The people who returned to join with those who had never left needed a revival. What would inspire them? What would encourage them? A new temple? The repairing of the walls? The replacing and repairing of all the gates that had been damaged and taken away? As long as it was left like that, they felt disgrace. They felt that God had left them. You know, you remember when Jesus was crucified, the curtain between the holy place and the most holy place, it was torn from top to bottom. Was that the moment in time symbolically where God left the building? When Solomon's temple was destroyed, was that the moment where the people would feel that God has left us, has abandoned us? It's not Elvis that we need to say is leaving the building. It's about God. We need to keep God here in us. Now, I told them about the gracious hand of my God, about what the king had also said to me. And they replied, so let us start rebuilding. And then they started, and then the objections, then the opposition, and then they were told to have a sword or a spear in one hand and work tools in the other, and not to let their guard down. The work stops for a while. And they think they've succeeded. But they don't know God, and they don't know Nehemiah. And the walls will be finished in 52 days, period. There were words of contempt. But you also balance it with words of conviction. The God of heaven will give us success. You know, the church, for the most part, in the 21st century, we don't do revivals anymore, do we? We don't do gospel meetings anymore. We don't do Sunday night either. What we do is we just keep time. We just keep church. We've got to do more than just keep it as it is. We have got to rise up and build. We have got to rise up and reach out. We've got to rise up and go to work for God. So there's the three, the Horonite, the Ammonite, and the Arab. They mocked us. What is this thing that you are doing? Don't you realize you're going against the king of Persia here? And what does Nehemiah produce? Letters with the king's seal on it. See? This is his will. I speak for the king. So I answered them and said, God, the God of heaven, will give us success. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build and go to work. Do you believe that? We're almost done. Digging in a wee bit deeper. What are you building or not building? You building for yourself, or are you building for the kingdom? Luke 12, 16 to 21, Luke 18, 18 to 23. We'll come back to that in a moment. What helps or guides you to keep pure motives in your decisions and actions in life before God? Does it come down to being rich toward God, or being rich toward yourself? Serving yourself, or serving someone other than yourself? Serving God. In Luke 18, the rich young ruler comes and he says, what must I do to inherit? How can you sort of just give me the rubber stamp that I'm getting eternal life because I've done it all? I've checked all the boxes. And Jesus said one thing that the man didn't think to consider. Give all that you have because you love it so much. Sell it all and give it to the poor. And then you will know eternal life. And the man went away because he had too many things, and he wasn't willing to give them up because he was building for himself rather than building for God. How can the record of the differing motives behind "let us build" help us to frame our motives and actions today in God's kingdom? In Genesis 11:4, a whole group of people says, "Let us build a tower to make a name for ourselves." Nehemiah 2:17-18, "Let us rise up and build because God is with us, because we're doing it not for the glory of Israel, but for the glory of God." In 2 Chronicles 14:7, "Let us build because we have sought the Lord our God." That happened in the days of Asa, king of Judah. He was one of the good ones, I think. And Ezra 4:1-5, "Let us build with you." Oh, somebody comes along. Neva, they come along and they say, "Oh, this is wonderful. Could we help you?" They want to help. Ezra sees through them. He says, "You neither have a part in this." They say, "Oh, we've been worshiping all along the same, but there's no temple there. They have no priesthood there. They have adulterated it all." And he says, "You need to look at your hearts." Romans 8:31, "As long as you know that God is for you, it doesn't matter who is against you." Whether you're rebuilding a wall or rebuilding a life. In Nehemiah 6:15, here's where God guaranteed the success that Nehemiah said they would have. "So the wall was completed on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. Verse 16 of Nehemiah 6, "When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid." They lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Who has more confidence? The world or God's church? It's all about attitude, isn't it? It's all about offering ourselves first and foremost to give ourselves to God. Are we in God's good hands? Our efforts do matter, but they won't succeed by themselves. If we ask God our Father for help, I believe He will give us that help. Every task that He gives us, His hands is in His hands as well. Will you now ask God to give you a hand with what's going on in your life? The last thought. Let us pray for God's powerful hand to be at work in our everyday lives. Next week, the nation's plea. Jeremiah, Lamentations chapter 5. Here is another great prayer that begins, "Restore us to yourself, Lord, that you may return and renew our days as of old." The lesson is yours. Man, it's great to see you. How we doing? Yeah. Boy, those boys are growing like weeds. Yes.